On the banks of the River Risen in Michigan, families once gathered for joy, picnics, and the simple peace that water always promises. The Swan Boat Club, with its charm and cheerful gatherings, stood as a place where laughter echoed and children ran free. But beneath that calm surface, a night came when laughter ended in screams, and 2 innocent lives slipped away forever. What began as an evening of community and warmth became one of the darkest nights in the area's history, a night that would raise questions that still feel impossible to answer. It was not just the horror of death, but the chilling indifference that followed, which would haunt everyone who learned the truth. 2 children, with futures full of promise, never made it back home. Their families did not just lose their loved ones. They were forced to live through a nightmare of excuses, denials, and chilling lies that shook the foundations of trust in their community. The evening started like so many others at the Swan Boat Club. Families arrived with food and folding chairs. Children darted about the open space, and boats swayed gently on the docks under the fading light. The atmosphere was lively, full of conversation and the faint smell of grilled food. Parents let their children play freely, trusting the safety of a familiar community space. Nobody thought they were standing at the edge of disaster. The youngest guests were running along the grass, chasing each other, their laughter carrying over the water. But when the sun dipped low and shadows spread across the club's grounds, the calmness of the evening turned into something much darker. A small moment of carelessness mixed with arrogance, and tragedy unfolded. 2 children ended up in the water, a place that should have been safe, yet became a trap. The current was not raging, but water does not need violence to claim lives. It only needs a moment of neglect. What is most haunting is not only that the children slipped under, but that the people around them did not move with urgency. Some guests noticed, others froze, but the one person who could have acted quickly, who should have screamed, jumped in, or fought with everything she had, did not. Instead, she gave excuses, words in place of action, deflection instead of desperation. While the seconds ticked by, seconds that could have meant survival, precious time was lost. The water closed in, and 2 young souls slipped beyond reach. The aftermath was chaos. Parents screamed, running toward the docks, plunging into the water themselves, clawing at the river as if their hands could drag back time. The Swan Boat Club, once a place of cheer, became a scene of flashing lights, frantic rescue attempts, and wails that pierced the night. Those sounds, the sounds of parents realizing their children were gone, would remain in the air long after the ambulances drove away. But in that chaos, people began to notice something else, something even more disturbing. Instead of sharing in the agony, instead of collapsing in grief, one figure stood apart. She did not weep, she did not rage, she excused. She explained away what had just happened as though her words could wash away the horror. That coldness, that absence of human reaction, left witnesses shaken to their core. As investigators arrived, they were met with a wall of confusion and pain. Everyone had seen pieces of the tragedy, everyone had their own angle of what happened, but the most important account, the one belonging to the adult responsible, was wrapped in contradictions. She insisted she had tried, that the children had wandered, that no one could have stopped it. But the tone of her voice, the casual nature of her claims, only drew suspicion. Parents who had just lost everything now faced the unbearable reality that someone they trusted might have stood by while their children drowned. This was no simple accident. It was a crime layered in negligence and indifference. The Swan Boat Club murders, as the case became known, forced the community to confront something they never wanted to believe, that danger does not always come from strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes it comes from the person who insists nothing is wrong, the one who smooths over tragedy with excuses. In this case, 2 children were gone forever, and all that was left behind were explanations that did not fit, excuses that felt rehearsed, and a hollow silence where accountability should have been. The investigation into the Swan Boat Club tragedy did not begin with certainty, but with chaos. Detectives arrived at a scene heavy with grief. Parents collapsed on the grass, the river's surface broken only by rescue divers and flashing lights reflecting off the dark water. The bodies of the children were eventually pulled out, lifeless and pale, their small forms carried up the embankment beneath a sky that had gone cruelly silent. Everyone who stood there that night knew they had witnessed a nightmare, but the investigators had to do what grieving families could not. They had to ask why. How could 2 children have gone into the water unnoticed for so long? And how could the very person responsible for them not act with the desperation of a guardian fighting for life? The first interviews revealed a sharp divide in perspectives. Some guests at the club recalled hearing splashes and seeing small hands waving above the waterline. They remembered panic erupting only when it was too late. Others insisted that the woman who was supposed to be supervising them downplayed the seriousness from the beginning, almost as though she wanted to convince herself and everyone else that it was not happening. She claimed she thought the children were playing, that they were strong swimmers, and that someone else would handle it. But the more she spoke, the more those around her began to feel an unease that chilled deeper than the water itself. Police pieced together a timeline. The children were last seen near the docks, giggling, too close to the edge without the safety of life jackets. Witnesses stated they slipped in quietly, without the dramatic thrashing that might have drawn immediate attention. Yet when seconds passed into minutes and panic should have overtaken any caretaker, the response was disturbingly detached. Instead of rushing to the water, instead of rallying everyone nearby, she hesitated. She insisted she shouted, and she insisted she sought help, but no one could recall hearing the desperation in her voice. It was as though she had already resigned them to fate before help could even arrive. The autopsies confirmed drowning. The children had no bruises, no signs of violence, but their lungs told the story of silence filling with water. What investigators needed to know was whether this was negligence so extreme it crossed the line into crime. The law is clear. When entrusted with children, responsibility is not optional. It is not enough to say, "I thought they would be fine." It is not enough to excuse inaction with confusion or shock. Parents trusted her, and in that trust lay the weight of accountability. Interviews stretched into the early hours. The woman responsible repeated her story again and again, weaving it with small variations, blaming shadows, confusion, and noise from the gathering. But detectives are trained to notice what does not change: the lack of emotion, the absence of genuine grief. She never once broke down at the thought of their final moments. She never pleaded with officers to believe she tried her best. Instead, she offered reasons, cold, polished, rehearsed reasons. They sounded like shields, words meant to push away blame rather than face it. As news of the children's death spread beyond the club, the community reacted with fury. Parents who had once laughed together at Swan boat gatherings could no longer trust the ground they stood on. They demanded justice. Rumors began to grow, twisting through every corner of the town. Some whispered that she had been distracted, more concerned with her socializing than the children in her care. Others speculated darker motives, refusing to believe any normal adult could respond so passively unless there was something sinister beneath the surface. The prosecutor's office faced an agonizing choice. Charging someone with murder required proof of intent, proof that she wanted the children to die. What they had was not intent but a mountain of neglect, a chilling lack of urgency that any parent or decent adult would have shown. So they considered a different path: involuntary manslaughter, a charge built on the idea that recklessness and carelessness can be just as deadly as violence. This was not a case of someone wielding a weapon, but a case where inaction itself became the weapon. The parents, meanwhile, were lost in grief. Their statements were filled with anguish, but also a desperate need to see accountability. They wanted the world to know that their children had not simply fallen in and been forgotten. They wanted recognition that someone's failure had stolen futures filled with birthdays, school days, and milestones that would never come. At vigils held near the water, candles flickered and parents clutched photographs, while whispers of blame echoed louder with each passing day. The Swan Boat Club, once a symbol of community, now bore the stain of tragedy. Its docks, once alive with the footsteps of children, became a place people avoided. The name itself began to draw associations not with summer joy, but with loss and betrayal. And as the trial loomed, the central question remained: how could anyone stand so still while children drowned before their eyes? When the case reached the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Families filled the benches, their faces drawn, carrying photographs of the children whose voices would never again echo across the Swan Boat Club. Reporters lined the back, their pens ready, because this was more than a local tragedy. It was a case that touched on the very definition of responsibility. The prosecutor stood before the jury and painted the scene not as an unavoidable accident, but as a chilling failure of duty. 2 young lives were gone, not because nature had taken them, but because the one adult who should have been fighting to save them did not. The defense, however, presented a different picture. They claimed it was shock, not neglect, that had frozen her in place. They argued that water rescues are difficult, that panic clouds judgment, and that no one could prove she had wanted those children harmed. They pointed out that dozens of people were at the club that night, yet none managed to save the children. Why, then, should all the blame fall on one person? They tried to frame her not as cold, but as overwhelmed, a woman in the wrong place at the worst time. But the witnesses told a different story, one after another. Members of the Swan Boat Club testified that her behavior was unusual, unsettling even. They recalled her lack of urgency, how her voice never carried the terror of someone watching children disappear beneath the surface. Parents spoke of how they themselves jumped into the river without hesitation, clawing at the water, screaming their children's names, while she stood at the edge, repeating that it was too late. Her words, those excuses, rang out in testimony like echoes of betrayal. One witness described how, in the middle of chaos, she mentioned that they should not have been near the dock, instead of crying out in grief. Another recalled her saying that someone else would see them, as though passing responsibility could erase her own. The prosecutor seized on these words, hammering home the idea that excuses had replaced action, that she had chosen to rationalize while seconds slipped away. Each statement built the image of not just negligence, but a chilling absence of humanity in the very moment when humanity was most required. The jury listened to the autopsy reports, the medical examiner describing how quickly the children could have been saved if immediate action had been taken. They listened to experts explain that drowning does not always come with wild thrashing, that it is often silent, and that a vigilant caretaker should have recognized the danger at once. They listened as the parents broke down on the stand, their voices cracking under the weight of loss, begging the court to see that their children's lives had been stolen not only by water, but also by neglect. The defense tried to recover ground by calling attention to her own background, her life and her struggles, hoping to draw sympathy. They painted her as misunderstood, a victim of judgment. But it was her own demeanor that undid those efforts. When she took the stand, her words carried the same detached tone that had haunted witnesses from the start. She spoke more about herself than the children. She detailed how she felt attacked by rumors and how she felt pressured by the police, but she rarely mentioned the children by name. The jury watched closely, and many could see what parents had felt that night: the absence of visible grief, the hollow rhythm of excuses. By the time closing arguments arrived, the courtroom was thick with emotion. The prosecutor's words cut like a blade. When a child is in the water, you do not make excuses. You do not wait. You act. And when you fail to act, when you choose excuses over life, you are guilty. The defense pleaded for understanding, for recognition of human imperfection, but the silence that followed was telling. The jury did not see a woman paralyzed by fear. They saw someone who had abandoned her duty in the most critical moment. When the verdict was finally read, the room seemed to hold its breath. The jury declared her guilty, not of murder, but of involuntary manslaughter. It was a charge that captured the essence of what had happened: 2 children gone because of reckless disregard, because of a choice to explain instead of fight. Gasps and sobs erupted across the benches, some from relief, others from the raw wound of knowing no sentence could bring the children back. The sentencing phase brought another wave of emotion. Parents spoke again, this time directing their words toward the woman herself. They described birthdays that would never come, toys left untouched, and empty chairs at family tables. They begged her to acknowledge what she had done, to show even a flicker of remorse. But her response remained muted, as though she were a spectator to her own story, distant and unshaken. That, perhaps more than anything, became her lasting image in the minds of the grieving community. The Swan Boat Club case was not just about law, it was about morality, about the deep expectation that those entrusted with children must act without hesitation. The guilty verdict gave families a measure of justice, but it could not answer the haunting question: why did she choose excuses over action? After the verdict was delivered, the Swan Boat Club community found itself standing at a crossroads. Justice had spoken through the jury, but the weight of grief still pressed against every parent, neighbor, and friend who had watched the case unfold. The courtroom emptiness after sentencing carried echoes of both relief and sorrow. A conviction had been secured, yet 2 small coffins had already been lowered into the ground. No law, no prison term, and no guilty verdict could ever replace the lives that had been lost. For the families, the true sentence was eternal, an endless cycle of memories that could never grow into milestones. The judge handed down a prison term, years that were meant to symbolize accountability. In his remarks, he spoke of responsibility, of the sacred duty every adult carries when children are placed in their care. He reminded the court that excuses are not protection, and that silence in the face of danger can be just as deadly as violence itself. The woman was led away in shackles, her expression unchanged, her gaze distant. Reporters noted how she seemed untouched by the gravity of what had been said, as though she were leaving a room where only words had been exchanged, not lives condemned. That absence of remorse remained the detail most seared into the public memory. Outside the courthouse, the parents spoke to cameras through tears. They held framed photographs, voices trembling as they declared that their children's names would not be forgotten. Their words were not only a cry for remembrance, but a warning to every parent watching: never assume safety, never surrender vigilance, and never trust someone who treats responsibility as an afterthought. The Swan Boat Club tragedy had taken their children, but they hoped it would also awaken a wider world to the dangers of indifference. In the weeks that followed, the Swan Boat Club itself became a ghost of its former self. Once the heart of family gatherings and summer evenings, it now carried a weight that no laughter could overcome. Parents no longer brought their children to play near the water. The sight of the dock, once innocent, now summoned images of small bodies sinking beneath the surface. Membership dwindled, events were cancelled, and whispers of selling the property began to circulate. The club was not just scarred, it was broken, its identity forever reshaped by what had happened. Community meetings turned into heated debates. Some demanded stricter safety regulations, arguing that no child should ever be near the water without life jackets and designated supervisors. Others argued that rules were meaningless if the human element, caring enough to act, was missing. The town council installed new safety signs, purchased rescue equipment, and even considered closing parts of the club, but none of it eased the ache in the parents' hearts. For them, every precaution came too late. Every improvement felt like a bandage placed over a wound that could never heal. The woman's family remained divided. Some defended her, clinging to the belief that she had been overwhelmed, that she had not meant harm. Others distanced themselves, horrified by her lack of public remorse. Friends who once stood by her now avoided her name, unwilling to be associated with the case. She had become both infamous and isolated, a figure whose face stirred anger wherever it appeared in newspapers or broadcasts. As months turned into years, anniversaries of the tragedy brought the families and their supporters back to the water's edge. They lit candles, placed flowers on the dock, and released lanterns into the night sky. Each vigil carried with it the same haunting question: could the children have been saved if she had acted without hesitation? The answer was always yes, and that truth cut deeper than any verdict ever could. The sight of parents kneeling by the river each year was a reminder that justice in court is not the same as justice in the heart. The case also became a cautionary tale far beyond Michigan. Newspapers across the country ran features on the Swan Boat Club murders, dissecting the psychology of indifference and the dangers of misplaced trust. Schools and organizations used the story in training sessions, teaching adults that vigilance is not optional. Law enforcement agencies reminded communities that negligence can kill as surely as violence. Slowly, the tragedy transformed from a local horror into a nationwide lesson. Responsibility for children is not a burden, but a sacred promise, one that cannot be excused away when disaster strikes. And yet, despite the broader impact, the Swan Boat Club murders remain a wound that never fully closed. The surviving families continued to live with the echoes of that night, their homes forever quieter, their tables forever missing 2 seats. They spoke often of how grief becomes a companion, how it follows you into every ordinary moment, and how no sentence can replace the sound of your child's laughter. Their pain became the most powerful testimony, a living reminder that what was lost could never be repaid. Years passed, but the Swan Boat Club murders refused to fade from memory. For the families who lost their children, time did not heal. It only deepened the awareness of what was gone. Each birthday that passed without candles, each holiday without laughter, became another reminder of futures stolen. Parents described the silence in their homes as unbearable. The toys that gathered dust, the rooms left untouched because stepping inside was too painful. They carried with them the image of that night, the flashing lights, the cries, the excuses, all of it fused into a memory that haunted their sleep and followed them into daylight. For the broader community, the tragedy lingered like a scar. Even those who were not present at the Swan Boat Club felt the shadow of what had happened. Children once allowed to roam freely, were now held tighter by their parents' hands. Families grew cautious of gatherings near the water, and strangers began to view one another with suspicion. The idea that someone could stand by unmoved, while 2 children drowned, had unsettled the very foundation of trust. It was not the river itself that frightened them. It was the thought of human indifference. The Swan Boat Club never recovered its old identity. Though it remained physically standing, its reputation was shattered. Families who once looked forward to its events withdrew permanently, unwilling to set foot in a place that had become synonymous with grief. Even renovations and safety upgrades could not erase the association. Locals whispered about shutting it down entirely, saying the land itself had absorbed too much sorrow to be enjoyed again. Visitors who came from outside the community sometimes asked to see the infamous dock, not as a place of leisure, but as a site of dark history. The once innocent setting had become a landmark of tragedy. The woman at the center of the case served her sentence, but she could not escape the judgment of the public. To many, her punishment seemed small compared to the magnitude of the loss. Her name became a symbol of neglect, whispered with disgust. Taught in conversations about responsibility and care, she tried to explain herself in letters and interviews, but her words only deepened the impression of excuses. There was no remorse strong enough to soften the anger of the parents, and no number of years behind bars could balance the scales of 2 lost lives. When she was eventually released, she found herself an outcast, living in isolation, a figure defined forever by a single night of inaction. The legacy of the case reached far beyond Michigan, across the country. It became an example studied in discussions of child safety and criminal law. Legal scholars debated where the line between accident and crime should be drawn, and how society should respond when negligence claims lives. Advocates used the case to push for stronger protections for children at public gatherings, arguing that no one should ever again die because of hesitation or carelessness. Schools, camps, and community organizations shared the story during training sessions, reminding adults that excuses have no place when a child is in danger. For the families, however, the story was not a lesson, it was life. They attended vigils each year, standing by the river with candles in hand, speaking their children's names aloud so the world would not forget. They told stories about who their children were, what they loved, and what they might have become. They made sure the community remembered not just the tragedy, but also the joy of those short lives. Their grief became activism. Some pushed for new laws, others volunteered with safety organizations, and all of them were determined to prevent another parent from living their nightmare. The Swan Boat Club murders remind us of a truth both simple and unbearable, that in moments of crisis, hesitation can be fatal. The woman responsible chose words over action and excuses over instinct, and in doing so, she crossed a line that could never be redrawn. The story has lived on not because of its violence, but because of its silence. The silence of 2 children beneath the water, and the silence of the adult who should have fought for them. Even today, people still speak of that night as if it just happened. It is a story parents tell their children when teaching them about safety, a story communities recall when building new rules of vigilance. It is a wound that transformed into a warning, and at its center remains the memory of 2 children whose lives were brief, whose deaths were senseless, but whose names will never truly disappear. The Swan Boat Club murders left behind more than a courtroom transcript and a newspaper headline. They left behind a warning etched in grief. When 2 children slipped beneath the water that night, it was not only the river that claimed them. It was hesitation, negligence, and a chilling indifference that turned seconds into eternity. The tragedy was not born from violence in the traditional sense. It came from the absence of something we take for granted, the instinct to act, to fight for life, no matter the cost. That absence is what made the story so unbearable, and what ensured it would be remembered long after the lights of the courthouse dimmed. For the families, their grief will never be measured in years served or verdicts written. Their grief lives in quiet homes, in toys untouched, and in the ache of imagining who their children might have become. They carry with them the burden of memory, not by choice, but by love, and through vigils, through activism, and through the courage to speak their children's names aloud, they refuse to let the world forget. Their loss has become their voice, and that voice is a powerful reminder that justice is not only about punishment, it is about recognition. Recognition that their children mattered, that their lives were worth protecting, and that their deaths were not the result of fate, but of failure. The community around the Swan Boat Club has never been the same. A place once filled with music and laughter is now a symbol of caution, a reminder of how quickly joy can collapse into horror. Some avoid it entirely, unable to face the memories. Others visit as a way to remember, to honor, and to keep alive the lessons paid for with innocence. Whether avoided or embraced, the club has been forever transformed, its name carrying a weight that no new paint or safety equipment can erase. And what of the woman at the center of it all? She served her sentence, but her punishment did not end when the cell doors opened. Her name, her face, and her story remain bound to the tragedy. She became an emblem of excuses, a figure defined not by what she did, but by what she failed to do. In the eyes of the families, no amount of time, no apology, and no explanation could ever balance the scales. She walked out of prison, but she will never walk out of the shadow of that night. This case became more than a local story, because it struck at something universal, the expectation of responsibility. It reminded us that every moment counts, that every adult entrusted with a child carries a duty that cannot be shrugged away. When a child's life is on the line, there is no room for excuses. You act, or you live forever with the weight of not acting. The Swan Boat Club murders taught communities across the nation that vigilance is not optional, and that the price of neglect is written in the loss of futures that should have been. As we reflect on this story, we are left with more than sorrow. We are left with responsibility. To never forget the children whose lives ended too soon. To never allow indifference to replace action. To ensure that when the moment comes, whether it is at a riverbank, a street corner, or anywhere danger meets innocence, we do not hesitate. Because the difference between life and death can be measured in seconds, and in choices made without excuses. This is not only the story of two children who drowned. It is the story of what happens when duty fails, when silence takes the place of love, and when excuses become deadlier than weapons. It is a story that should haunt us, because only by being haunted can we ensure it never happens again. And so the Swan Boat Club murders remain carved into history, not just as a tragedy, but as a lesson that responsibility is sacred, a lesson that indifference can kill, and a lesson that we must carry forward for the sake of every child whose laughter still echoes, fragile and precious, across the waters of life.